Hosein, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast today. I'm really excited to have you on. I've been fortunate enough to go through your book and understand a little bit about the work you're doing. And it's been a mission of mine as well on this podcast to talk through spirituality and understand different ways of looking at our health. And often Western medicine hasn't always given us the complete answer. But I do want to explore that with you today, and also not only for myself, but also for the listeners to understand your focus on the default mode network and the work you've done. But before we jump into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, what's brought you here, and some of the work you've been doing in this field.
Absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. And my background, so I'm a physician scientist. I signed up to do this to help people.
Yeah.
And really, my mission has been taking these groundbreaking scientific discoveries and helping people by communicating what is this really all about, translating those discoveries into actual help for people, for patients. So my sort of day job, I'm an oncologist, cancer drug developer. I take basic science from the bench to develop new cancer medicines. But also I've had this mission as well on the more on the mental health, the neuroscience side, where I'm taking these discoveries in neuroscience that's telling us how the brain works and really trying to communicate these findings and the massive help that these discoveries can actually make for people. When you understand how your brain works, it can be an absolute game changer. And it was for me, by the way. This was also a
Mhm.
personal journey for me. 2 years ago, I went through, began a journey, really, a 6 month
Mhm.
journey where I finally went deep inside and resolved a lot of issues that I had. So, a lot of this, I'm bringing all these tools in this book. It's called Breakthrough, Master Your Default Mode, and Thrive. It's meant to have all of those tools, the medical, the scientific, the spiritual, all the tools for anyone looking for better health and happiness for them to have, basically. That's really the mission I have. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And just going through your book, what I came to realize, it was a deep exploration. And I do want to understand that because you do touch on quite a bit. You touch on spiritual practices and the whole concept of spirituality, but also some philosophical ideas from the past, from ancient history. And often we lose sight of that. And I think philosophically, I think there's an aspect of arrogance that comes through in society today where we feel like we can dispense with the old just because we have science on our side and more scientific advancement. But what shifted for you? As
Yeah.
you said, you're a physician.
I think what shifted is the science has finally caught up to the ancient philosophy. The science
Mhm,
has finally caught up with the spirituality. I mean, for the
mhm,
last 200, 300 years, science has been dismissing religion as not relevant because
mhm,
science has been able to explain everything. But now I'm seeing clinical studies showing the massive positive health benefits of spirituality, of
mhm,
having, I'm talking about the core values in every religion. I'm not talking about the politics of religion. I'm talking
mhm,
about at the heart of Buddhist practice, at the heart of Christian practice, the power of compassion, the power of virtue and integrity, forgiveness, empathy, those core values that Jesus talked about, Buddha talked about, the Eightfold Noble Path. The science is now showing that when you embrace those, the five precepts of Buddhism and the teachings of Christ, when you actually day to day embrace those teachings, it actually improves your health.
mhm,
So this is what the science is now showing. So now you can no longer ignore it because the data, and there are countless studies that I describe in this book, but I summarize it in a way that's very simple. Essentially, studies showing that these spirituality improves your health, lowers cortisol, stress hormones. If we had a pill that could cut cortisol in half, it'd be $1 billion blockbuster. But that's
yeah,
exactly what compassion exercises do. That's exactly what spiritual practices do. So I think what's happened now is science and medicine are taking a seat at the table with spirituality and mental health. They're finally all sitting at the table, and it makes for an amazing conversation. It's a whole new dimension to this journey of self discovery, basically.
mhm. Absolutely. And I know you touched on the political side of religion, but what about I would look at it almost as a political side to Western medicine as well. And the amount of money that's generated in that industry, especially around cancer,
Yeah.
do you feel like there's resistance based on that too, to look at some of these ancient practices because of what it can mean for the bottom line?
Yeah. I think that might actually explain my journey, the way you described that. I think 2 years ago, it was actually 2 years this week, I was
Mhm,
out in Cancun on a vacation, and I
mhm,
was deeply unhappy. And I was looking inside, I'm like, "Why am I unhappy? I'm making a phenomenal salary, physician scientist, developing cancer drugs, house and cars and all that. I'm supposed to be happy about this point. I'm supposed to
mhm,
be fulfilled." But there was such a void, a deep void, unhappiness. And I think
mm,
what was missing was that spirituality. And so for me, that was like a 6-month journey. I have many colleagues who are like that, colleagues who look should be very successful, but are just personally, spiritually unhappy. And I think it is a reflection um, of of medicine, Western medicine. That
mm,
why is it that we're living longer than ever before? We have these amazing medicines, and yet our mental health is suffering. Addiction is on the rise. Suicide is on the rise. There's something wrong. And I think now that we're starting to see science embracing that spirituality, I think this is just the beginning, but I think we're finally going to get at those core issues of what does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to be
mhm,
fulfilled? And I hope and I think Western medicine is transforming, and I think it
mhm,
is becoming more holistic, less reductionist. And I think that's what this book is all about. And it's all this is just beginning. It's just the start of it.
yeah. Yeah, and I think there's something you touched on there, the whole idea of utopia, and there's been different studies done around that. Dostoevsky also talked about it. If we were in a complete state of utopia, we would just, you know, tear apart ourselves to shreds. And I think there's something to be said about that, to the point you're making, where we don't have the same threats our ancestors did. Life is a lot easier, but for some reason we're unhappy. And maybe what is missing is that lack of meaning or fulfillment, to your point. So just to understand further, and there's something you put a Michelangelo quote in your book around the it's everything is there. We just need to chip
That's
away
right.
at it slowly. So
Yeah.
what was that exploration like for you to have that realization that you're not fulfilled while on paper you should be?
Yeah.
So how were you able to find that then?
Of self-discovery and self-understanding. In particular, really coming to truly understand how the brain works.
Mhm,
And this is where the science comes in. So it turns out our brain has at least 7 networks. So
mhm,
network, all it means is different parts of the brain that connect to do a function for you. So you've got the visual network, helps you see, auditory network, it helps you hear. Then you get to this one network, one of the 7, it's called the default mode network.
mhm,
What it is your ego. We now have a name for the ego, and this is the name for the ego. The way to recognize the default mode network is anytime your mind wanders away from the present. Whenever that happens, take a look at those thoughts that appear. You tend to go back into the past or you go into the future, and it tends to be a place that is self obsessive. And so that is the default mode network that actually turns on. It's also called the wandering mind. When you really come to understand it, and in particular, observe it, because when you're observing your mind, the default mode network is off. That observing mind is one of the other 7 networks. It's called the central executive network.
mhm,
And so this is in a way what Buddha described when he talked about turning on that observing mind and being present and mindful. When you're present, mindful, meditating or praying, let's say, that is your central executive that is on. And when you strengthen that observing mind and you come to really understand this default mode network, it can change your life. It definitely changed mine. And so, and so the science is now pointing in this direction.
mhm,
What is the quality, the true quality of that observing mind? Many of us may not spend much time in it, but the more time you spend in that observing mind, you realize it's a much happier place to be, right? That central executive is less obsessed about me and I. It's actually the mind that is present, that recognizes that all life is interconnected. that it has this expansive consciousness. It's a place of peace. And I think what Buddha and Jesus, all the prophets, I think what happened with all of them is they came to really live in that central executive. That's just the name of the network, but
Mhm.
they recognize this wandering mind, this monkey mind. They realize that's actually not who we are. And they shifted themselves over to that observing mind. That observing mind isn't always happy, but it tends to be a peaceful place to be, generally speaking. Anxiety comes, stress comes, but you can observe it and it doesn't overcome you. It doesn't conquer you. Um, and so that's really what my journey was about. Now, I did embrace Buddhism. I did embrace Christian practice, a lot of very practical tools.
Mhm.
Spiritual prayer was very powerful as well. So this book, I try to put all the tools in one place. And by the way, I each chapter is about a knot. So I don't call it a disease, syndrome, disorder. I call it a knot, like a muscle knot. It's something that could be very firm and tense, but you can untie the knot. It is possible to reverse it. And so there's 11 of these in the book. It starts with stress, and each chapter walks you through what is this knot? Why does it happen? And how do you overcome it? So there is a remedy for each of these. It starts with stress, and we can talk about what these knots
Mhm.
are. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that. I just want to explore the idea of the default mode network a bit further and some of the things you've already talked about by being lost in the past or the future or getting obsessed with the future and the whole notion of meditation. I think there's been tons of research done. I don't know whether it was CT scans or MRIs they did on monks who meditated and found their brain health. I don't know if you're familiar with that study.
Absolutely.
I might. Yeah. So what did they find from your? Yeah.
There have been dozens of studies, and there actually I cite many of them in this book.
Mhm.
Basically, monks who meditate, they tend to be actually they're in that observing mind. They're in that central executive. So their default mode network is less active. You can actually see the default mode network on an fMRI. And so there was a study, for example, they put volunteers and monks in an MRI scanner. They rang a bell, and 10 seconds later, they would be a zap. The volunteer would be zapped. So in the minds of the normal people, the bell would ring, and you can see on the fMRI all the anxiety, all the stress that was there in anticipation of the shock. But the meditators, the bell rang, and there was no anxiety, there was no stress because the
Mhm.
meditator was present and those emotions weren't there. So other studies have shown meditation improves cortical thickness, improves memory, cognition, and I think with meditation you are literally rewiring your brain and you're getting out of that old reptilian monkey mind, the default mode network, and you're empowering this most recent development in the brain, the central executive, that observing mind, which is the highest part of our brain. And it's the part that other animals don't have. It's what makes us human.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's
And
pretty
how
amazing.
does then the more you're able to form those synaptic connections, like how does neuroplasticity come into this? And
We
because
are,
most people would, yeah, go
that's
ahead.
right. We are constantly changing. Our
Yeah.
cells are, well, every day, 1% of our cells are renewed. Every 300 days, there's essentially a new us. All of our cells have been renewed. Our neurons, they have plasticity. They are able to, new neurons are able to form. And so it turns out if you were to set an intention for for happiness, for peace, and with commitment and determination, you go on that journey, you can literally rewire your brain. You can untie the knots of stress, anxiety, addiction, emotional pain. And as long as you have that intention every day, you can literally overcome it
Mhm.
without the need for medication. Although medication helps, there's definitely a role for it. But just from intention and practice, you can overcome things like anxiety. There is neuroplasticity. Absolutely.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing there, and the point I want to get across for people is also it's never too late. And there's been a lot of focus, not only through like it's setting an intention as you touched on, but even gratitude can make a huge impact because we, again, as we were talking about earlier, we lose sight of the small things and being grateful for all the things that we have. We tend to focus on the things we don't have or finding the smallest problems to ruminate on. But
That's right.
the act of gratitude can have a significant impact too, from
Yeah.
just from personal experience.
And why is that? So the default mode network, it is the separate self. It's the thing that actually makes you feel separate, makes you feel like to be happy, you have to beat others.
Mhm.
Life is a game of musical chairs. And that reflects our old way of living when we were living in caves and jungles. Life was very hard. The only way we made it was to beat others. But that same default mode network is what traps us in selfishness, in pain and anxiety and loneliness. And so
Mhm.
loneliness is one of those mental knots. It's a big health problem, actually. And the way to
Yeah.
overcome loneliness is to cultivate gratitude and
Mhm.
compassion. Because what you're actually doing when you do that gratitude, you are lowering stress hormones like cortisol. Compassion exercises have been shown to cut cortisol in half. So, cortisol is a major stress hormone. It can wreak havoc on your body. It basically takes energy away from your immune system, away from your reproductive system, towards your brain. And yeah, it helped us get through periods of starvation. But now our thoughts can trigger cortisol, right?
Mhm.
Thoughts about yesterday. And yeah, so part of this is coming to really understand your default mode network and realize this thing is actually might be doing more harm than good and changing your relationship with it. And so for me, I actually express gratitude for my default mode. Anytime my mind wanders off now, I say, okay, it's trying to help me. And I say, thank
Mhm.
you. You just helped me get ready for some meeting tomorrow. So that
Yeah.
changing your relationship with it can change your life. So gratitude, very important.
Yeah. And often right now, because we have so much information available to us, there's this view that cortisol is bad, but I think cortisol serves a purpose and a function. It's only in excess when we're constantly in those elevated states of stress. That's when it becomes a problem. So I just want to make sure, because there is that
That's right.
notion people
Yeah.
perceive that cortisol is just bad.
So I have this analogy of, let's say you're driving down the road and you see a giant pothole on the road ahead. At that moment, your stress response kicks in, your pupils dilate, your heart races, and you steer clear of that pothole. That stress response just saved your life. But then
Mhm.
you keep driving and thoughts of yesterday, memories from long ago come, gives you some stress, and that same stress response kicks in. There's
Yeah.
healthy stress and there's bad stress. And so I think part of this is, yeah, you want good, healthy stress, but you also don't want to be suffering with excessive stress, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
coming to really understand that. So, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it earlier too, that reptilian response, because when I work in the anger management side with clients, that's the one area I try to focus on is there's a purpose to that threat response. It served our ancestors. Obviously, they were dealing with far bigger stressors and threats than we do today. But anytime we're in that elevated stress, like you said, then it starts affecting our immune system because our basically our body is diverting all its resources to responding to these perceived threats, which are often self-induced and made up in our own heads, which often also lead to anxiety, and that's some of the mental health issues that you've touched on we're experiencing. So coming back to the book and each knot, like help us understand how you've explored it and what was your determining factor around what is each knot? How do we
Right.
see that in our lives? And from my understanding, it is fairly generic in the sense that it does apply to everyone.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So, and these knots are presented in a particular order. So, number one is
Mhm.
stress. And again, coming to understand what, just as we talked about, what is
Yeah.
stress? What are the consequences of it? And the remedy for stress is mindful relaxation. Sounds a lot easier than it is. It's basically cultivating a state of relaxation where you've got that release of GABA, but doing it in a way that is mindful, where you spend 20 minutes allowing that GABA, to take hold. It's like the way I think about it. There was a book by a Buddhist monk, and he said, think about a very dirty pond that's very muddy. You're waiting, giving it some time for that mud to settle so that the water becomes clear. You're giving your body 20 minutes for those thoughts to calm down, for the GABA to get going. And what you'll notice, that GABA will protect you from the stress response. It is amazing. The body already has it. It's called GABA.
Mhm.
It will prevent stress from happening. So breathing exercises, mindfulness exercises, prayer, there's a whole bunch in the book, things that will make you prevent that stress. So stress is number one. Number two is emotional pain.
Mhm.
Many of us have it. I had it, ancestral pain handed down to me.
Mhm.
And so coming to understand how the brain, and particularly the default mode network, goes back into the past, brings back these memories and any emotions tied to it. And so overcoming emotional pain, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, all kinds of tools in there. But the most important, the power of forgiveness that will let you overcome old emotional pain. If it's self inflicted, it's self forgiveness, which is actually taking accountability, feeling that remorse, and letting that remorse restore and renew. So that's self forgiveness. But that emotional pain is a big driver of things like addiction, which is not number three. And so
Mhm.
addictive craving, I call it, not just to drugs and alcohol, but to information, to money, status, title, power, whatever it is,
Mhm.
coming to understand how this addictive craving is harming you, and then relying on the remedy there, which is the process of surrender,
Mhm.
recognizing that default mode network and this other part of the brain, nucleus accumbens, they've taken over, and surrendering, let's say, to a higher power, and developing your insightful awareness to lead you out of that darkness. So there are Christian based remedies, AA, for example, Buddhist based, kind of surrendering to the Dharma, but even just purely scientifically, surrendering to your, maybe your subconscious mind, a higher part of your brain to help you lead you out of that darkness. Those are the top three knots.
Mhm.
And then the others are a lot easier to untie when you've untied these. Lifestyle, I put at the very end, sleep, diet, and exercise, because I think a lot of our problems with weight, obesity are related to our knots. And when you untie the knots, it becomes a lot easier to lose weight, for example. So
Mhm.
lifestyle is towards the end.
Mhm. No, I appreciate that. And I do want to expand on the whole surrendering piece because there's an aspect of prayer that we talked about earlier too. And I want to also explore that with you. But in today's world, and I think you touch on it in your book too, around the instant gratification and how we get addicted to things because we're getting these cheap dopamine spikes. How do we become cognizant of that in our lives? Because I know for me too, it's the smallest things, right?
Yeah.
Being able to make an order on Amazon right away,
Yeah.
the simplest things that we take for granted now, and we're getting these dopamine
Right.
spikes. But there's something to be said about what I've come to realize, even in my own life and through personal experience, by setting goals and working towards something and experiencing the motivation just in that pursuit. Whereas now, what we've, at least what I've noticed about myself and some of the things I've understood is when the dopamine isn't necessarily released when we achieve it, it's more in that pursuit.
That's
So
right.
how do we become more aware of that?
Yeah.
Because and I think it's the optimal challenge as well, right? If we challenge ourselves too much, then we may not be motivated. And if the challenge isn't hard enough, then we might it's finding that
Yeah.
optimal level
Exactly.
of challenge.
I think part of this is turn on that observing mind and look
Mhm.
inside. And what do you see? Not all cravings are bad. The question is there a craving that's causing you harm to yourself and family? Only you know that. I don't know that. So look inside with that observing mind and ask yourself, if this craving is causing you to not sleep well at night or to wake up with anxiety, then maybe it is a harmful craving. And so, but part of it is that addictive craving is might seem nearly impossible to overcome. And it may take time. For me, it took months. It took me 6 months. But the most important thing is to look inside and ask yourself, am I at ease? Is this craving causing me harm? If it is, try setting an intention, right? A goal, but also an intention of, I want to be happy, and start that journey. Again, some of these cravings might be deeply wired and hard to overcome, but with intention, take that journey. And there are tools out there to help you, for example, shut off that default mode network. which tends to be a big driver of addiction. And so there are things like mindfulness practice, prayer, breathing exercises, focus exercises. And for very severe cases, things like plant medicines actually do shut off the default mode network. We're understanding what is the medical value there. I think there might be a role for that.
Mhm.
But look inside, set the intention, find those tools that will help you overcome that craving, and you can overcome it, right? Millions of people have over millennia. Take that journey. You'll end up in a much happier place. Again, may not happen overnight, but trust the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, how does prayer fit into this? Because you could look at meditation and breathing exercises. It's very internal based, right? You can observe the changes that are happening to you. And for me, I know, or for a fact, that prayers really helped me on my journey. But there's this notion that you're just putting it out there. You
Yeah.
don't know what's happening. You're putting it
Yeah.
out into the universe. So, how does prayer factor
Right.
into this,
Well,
and why does it help people?
I think prayer is a form of mindfulness exercise. So when you pray, first of all, you come into the present moment
Hmm.
with full honesty and full acceptance. Usually in a prayer, that's what you're supposed to do. And you communicate with that honesty, with that intention. Mindfulness practice is actually pretty similar. You come to the present moment, reality as it is, not through tainted glasses, but life
Hmm.
as it actually is. And so prayer, like the next time you're doing some breathing exercises, some mindfulness, just try doing a prayer and notice what it does to your focus and your presence. For me, it's like a jolt. Like anytime I'm trying to meditate and it's just not working, I just do a quick prayer and it brings me to the present.
Hmm.
And that is the quality of mindfulness, presence, that observing mind. I picture myself leaving Earth and looking out at the galaxy with all the stars out there, something far bigger than me. I just give some gratitude for it and I come to the present moment. Again, I would try it out.
Yeah.
Spend 5 minutes, look at the state of your mind, try a prayer. After 5 minutes, take a look. Did anything happen? Did anything change? And find this out for yourself.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think there's a couple of things that you touched on, which I think factor in as well around surrendering to that higher power and acceptance. And I think that can help you manage the anxiety as well, because you're saying, okay, not have all the answers to my current situation or whatever's going on, but I'm surrendering to it, and whatever may come, I'll accept it fully. And there's that, it can be uncomfortable for a lot of people
Yeah.
putting that out there, but
It can be inconvenient, uncomfortable in the short
yeah.
term, but give it some time, give it some patience. You'll find that these insights to your problems will appear.
Mhm.
Now, whether they come from God, whether they come from your deep subconscious, I'm not exactly sure, but
Yeah.
those insights will come when you least expect it. And I think so. Allow those insights to come. And you know what? There was a really cool story. This grad student out at University of Cambridge, he was working on solving the Sanskrit code. This was a like 1,000-year-old challenge that no one's been able to solve. So he spent like 6 months trying to solve this thing, and he was close to giving up. Took a month off, just went meditated, went deep inside, came back to the University of Cambridge, looked at it, and the solution was right there. The insight had been given to him. So
Yeah.
where that came from, who knows? But
Mhm.
those insights will come. You give it some time, give it some patience, and the way forward will be shown. And I think that reflects the true quality of our brain. What's actually there is a place of purification, regeneration. The mind and body heal, they naturally heal. The body will give you the signals to heal it if you allow it to. Just
Mhm.
listen, look inside, listen, and the way forward will be shown. That's
Mhm.
what all the prophets have said, basically.
Yeah, and there's so many stories like that. The one you shared about this Cambridge student is where people have had solutions come to them in their sleep, and a lot of these ideas that have come forward. So there is something to be said about that. And touching on the whole idea of prophetic figures and insights, how do you tie consciousness to the observing mind? Like, how do the two play together? Because there's a lot of focus on consciousness, and you can move up your level of consciousness, whatever that means for people. But how do you tie that together?
Yeah. I guess the question is, what is reality, right? And for the default mode network, reality is me and I, because that's what it's wired to do, to focus
Mhm,
on me and I. So the belief system there is about me and I. And you see the world in terms of that. Okay, whoever helps me, good person. Whoever doesn't help me, bad person. That's the ego.
mm,
Then you get into the central executive, that observing mind. It's less concerned about me. And I think the consciousness there is a recognition that there's something far bigger than me, that all of life is interrelated, including plants and animals. We're all interconnected. And by the way, beyond the Earth, there's something far bigger. And so that, for example, we have the Webb Space Telescope up there. It's looking out, and now it's seeing that it's estimating there are like 100 quintillion planets out there now. So that's like one followed by 20 zeros. That number is too big to even understand. So if Earth was one grain of sand, there are more planets in the universe than all the grains of sand on all the beaches of Earth.
yeah,
That's how small we are. So that's what the
yeah,
Webb Space Telescope is seeing. So I think when you're in that observing mind, there's a recognition of something far bigger out there, and there's
mhm,
a gratitude and admiration that we're a part of it. Like maybe we can't understand it, but thank you for being that I'm here, actually
mhm,
conscious of this. How miraculous is it? So I think those are the different types of consciousness. And it's interesting that plant medicines, by shutting off that default mode network, give you a glimpse of the
yeah.
universe. They give you a glimpse of that. And so, anyway, separate discussion.
Yeah, when you're able to realize how interrelated we are with everything, I think that's when a lot of that insight comes too, because now you're able to connect on a deeper level. And to your point, plant medicine allows us to do that. So I know you said it allows for shutting down that default mode network, but what's going on at a deeper level for individuals? Because there's been so much therapy. I know a lot of people that have been diagnosed with cancer have often used plant medicine to have some form of acceptance. So
Right.
what are they tapping into with respect to that?
Yeah.
And what's preventing them to tap into it
Yeah,
otherwise?
absolutely. It's obviously this is a place of very active investigation. For
Mhm,
4 decades, this was all illegal and we lost 40 years. But now we're starting to understand the medical value of these plant medicines. They're not yet approved. Okay. So
mhm,
there are clinical trials ongoing where you can access them legally. But I think what we're starting to see is that some of these naturally occurring mushrooms, cactus, for whatever reason, they can shut off this default mode network. Now, they don't shut off that default mode and turn on the central executive. They shut off the default mode and connect the rest of the brain together, parts of the brain that don't normally connect. So it is different than meditation. The two,
mhm,
but what they have in common is they shut off this monkey mind, which for many people, you mentioned cancer, anxiety, literally that default mode takes over and people have a hard time being present. They're just worried about the future, or they have depression thinking about the past. And just giving a temporary reprieve from that by chemically silencing that default mode allows them to realize I am not my thoughts. Actually, that anxiety is not who I am. That little bit of space is all they need to now embrace things like spirituality. So I think it's a tool that allows them to embrace a higher power. And for many people, it's been transformative. So I think we're still understanding what is the medical value. How should these be given safely? We're still understanding that, but those tools will now be coming. I think the next generation of therapists will have these new tools. I think they'll be very powerful.
mhm. Absolutely. And you mentioned that it also allows for different parts of the brain to connect. So, what are these connections that are being formed? Because the way I've also understood it is you're often like, it is a form of neuroplasticity. Once these connections are formed, it's hard to go back. So, you see a lot of people have new realizations through these experiences where they're able to find different meaning for whatever experiences they're dealing with in life or whatever their struggles might be. And we've touched on some people that are dealing with life-threatening illnesses too. But what's going on in these connections
Yeah.
that people are having these realizations?
Yeah, there are ongoing studies looking at patients with fMRI scanners and understanding what's going. We're still figuring it out, but I think there
Mhm,
is a global activation of connections, and I'm not sure if it's completely random
mhm,
or I think we're still figuring that out, but definitely parts of the brain that maybe haven't connected in a long time come together where, for example, people who have been lonely, suffering from loneliness, uh,
mhm,
it can actually open up those parts of the brain involved in compassion and gratitude. And so they can re experience that.
mhm,
Or people who were once spiritual and long forgot about it, these experiences can actually take them back to that spirituality, which can be
mhm,
transformative. It's like a jump start, right?
mhm,
And but a lot of this, as has been known, is your
mhm.
intention. So I think if you don't set an intention, you may not get any value from the experience.
Yeah,
But if you
yeah.
set that intention that I want to be spiritual, I want to regain my spirituality, it can actually help you a lot.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I know you touched on Buddha and the prophets, and you mentioned loneliness a couple of times, but these individuals were seeking solitude, so they were being alone. So why in today's society people are more prone to feeling lonely versus that solitude that some of these figures sought out to really dive into their spirituality? So what's the dichotomy here and why that struggle?
Yeah, I think so. The loneliness is an epidemic. We saw it with
Mhm,
COVID-19, forced social isolation, causing all kinds of mental health problems, anxiety, depression. And a big driver, again, is this default mode network. It's
mhm,
the part of the brain that makes you feel different and separate. And it can, instead of blaming, instead of solving your loneliness by seeking social connection, you can blame others for it. And that worsens the loneliness. It's like a downward spiral. And that
mhm,
ultimately can wreak havoc on your health. So I think what the prophets were doing is they were trying to understand themselves. They were trying to understand the nature of the brain by going out in solitude. And what they recognized is that our baseline brain is actually compassionate and loving.
mhm,
And that's what they discovered. Buddha and Jesus both discovered in solitude that the higher power or their natural part of the brain is a place of benevolence and compassion
mhm,
and patience. And it's interesting that both came to that conclusion.
mhm,
And so for people who are lonely, you are actually close to transcending that loneliness by kind of surrendering that ego, that default mode network, and looking inside, taking that journey. And I think it's a much happier place to be when you've overcome that loneliness. But the point is that loneliness can be overcome, it's
mhm.
reversible. There are
Yeah.
tools to get you out of it. It's not a permanent condition.
Yeah, and I can absolutely relate to that because I would say I had 2 phases to the COVID experience for myself. The first phase was loneliness because for me, it was like an immediate shock to not be able to be around people, and I was fairly extroverted going into the pandemic. And then the second phase was where I started to do the exact opposite, was enjoy that solitude, look at myself, heal myself, and I actually appreciated that time to the point where I started realizing being around people was so much more noisier and it was impacting my ability to connect with myself. And coming out of the pandemic, I've really embraced that solitude piece. But it's funny just looking at it in that span of 2 years, how I experienced two different extremes. And it was only brought about by a shift in my perspective and my mindset and really focusing on being in the present moment and connecting to
Yeah,
myself, which really helped. And
right.
then that led the way to some of the things we've already talked about and
Yeah,
being making intentions a priority, making prayer a priority. And that's really helped me.
Yeah.
as far as mental health
Loneliness,
goes.
yeah, just to add, there are people who are introverted, there are people who are
Hmm.
extroverted, and they all have different social needs. So,
Hmm.
loneliness, if you feel that loneliness, it's a signal that whatever your social needs are, whether you're introverted or extroverted, those needs aren't being met. And
Hmm.
so you can be introverted and have very limited social needs. As long as those needs are met, you won't feel lonely.
Yeah.
And so but we are social creatures. You know, and that loneliness is a signal. So if you feel that, turn on that observing mind and look at it objectively and try to understand a bit more about yourself. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and one of the things that I came across too recently, I was reading Robert Greene's book around mastery, and he touches on even mastering something requires you to use that observing mind, which again, we a lot of people struggle with. And that's why in today's world, it's easy to get distracted and not really feel like you're accomplishing anything or you're not able to master a topic or whatever endeavor you're seeking out. What are your thoughts around that? Because I thought that was pretty interesting, and
Absolutely.
preparing for this episode too.
Yeah. There are a lot of people I've talked to who say, I just can't meditate. I sit down, my thoughts are racing, I can't do it. And what I tell them is, you're doing it. You're actually doing it. You believe it or not, you are recognizing that your mind is distracted. And just as you would recognize that murky pond is murky and not clear, well, give it some time, give it 20 minutes and keep observing and see if there's any change. And what you might find is some of that mud settles down. There's a little bit more clarity.
Mhm,
Keep at it. Set that intention. You'll see day by day those distractions actually lessen and you can get a glimpse of your observing mind. So I think people think meditation is just sitting down and you're in peace. Actually, no. Meditation is sitting down and observing your mind for whatever is there. Stress, anxiety, whatever's there, you're observing it. And initially it might be hard, you get distracted, default mode turns on. But as long as you come back to the present and come back and observe, then you're doing it. You're doing it right. You want to notice those times that you've shifted away and take yourself back to the present. That is the key skill. And your brain will, that'll take, it'll be easier and easier to do it. And once that observing mind strengthens, it can change your life. That is a very
yeah.
powerful, you're using your central executive. And like you said, that's how you can master your default mode.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think what you're also touching on there is it's and I know you refer to Marcus Aurelius too in your book, but like the whole stoic idea of not getting too attached. Buddha talked about it too, in terms of the root of all suffering is attachment. And that could apply to both positive and negative experiences. And as you said, letting that water settle, the mud settle, you gain clarity. And I think whether you've had a positive experience or negative experience, we tend to label things right away and we get too excited or worked up about things. But it's taking that time to let things settle so you can have greater clarity. And it can vary on how much time is needed too. But I think, again, in the world we live in today, we're just reacting rather than slowing things down and responding to things as they come. And I think that can help to a lot of people and often does uh, force people
Absolutely.
to suffer, right? In terms of
Yeah,
their mental
absolutely.
health.
Yeah, that one there, Buddha's meditation, Vipassana, which is also called insight meditation. That was very powerful for me. That one I practiced myself. I didn't have 10 days to go on a retreat. I've got three young
Mhm.
kids, but you can do it yourself. And it's really recognizing three types of thoughts as craving, aversion, and sort of delusion, waiting for them to come and labeling them and letting them go. There's a process called the RAIN technique where you recognize, let's say, a craving, accept it, investigate it, non identify, let it go. And so when you turn on that observing mind and you recognize those three, you start to understand yourself and you find freedom from all those distractions. And you can end up in a much more peaceful place. I can tell you.
Mhm. Yeah.
So Vipassana for me was an absolute game changer. And I
Yeah,
describe it in this book also. Yeah.
for sure. And one of the last things I do want to ask you, because as an oncologist, one of the things I've come across in terms of the research, and there's a lot of talk about it now, where there's people saying that often stress or people not able to express their anger appropriately is leading to some people like being diagnosed with cancer because we all
Yeah.
have those cells in our body. What are your thoughts around that in terms of even just your work you're
Yeah.
doing?
The data is clearly showing there, and I've got tons of them in the book. There was one study, Women's Health Initiative, 70,000 women followed for 9 years, and none of them had cancer or heart disease to start the study. And they followed them to see which of these volunteers ended up with cancer or heart disease. And they found, yeah, the women who were most pessimistic, cynical, tended to get the higher rates of the cancer. Women who were happier had much less cancer and heart disease. So that's a correlative study. It doesn't prove it. But when you look at the totality of medical evidence, the physiology, it's pretty clear that stress response can weaken our immune system, allow cancers to take hold. And so, yeah, and this is a part that medicine hasn't really embraced. I think we
Mhm.
need to take a more holistic view that mental health has to be front and center. And by the way, there was another study, meta analysis. They looked at 9,000 papers out there, concluded that spirituality is a big driver of physical and mental health, resilience. It actually recommended our medical teams have one person who can do spiritual care. So, this is all the most recent science. I think we need to take a holistic view, and it'll will improve our patients' outcomes if we do. So
Yeah.
the science is now again taking a seat at the table with spirituality and mental health and other things.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And even in the space I'm working in the addiction side of things, we're embracing spirituality more and more. You touched on AA earlier, and definitely spirituality plays a huge role in that. But even some of the other forms of addiction we talked about, whether it could be to status, to power, to money, whatever it might be, I think everything we've touched on, having this deeper connection with a higher power, however you achieve that, I think everyone's spiritual journey is unique and different too. And we can't really try to follow someone's path. That may not work either. That's everything we've touched on. But this conversation has been great. Saying, I know we've covered a lot of ground, but is there anything else you feel like we didn't touch on that would be of value to the listeners that they can take back with them and
Yeah, there.
understand?
I mentioned there are another 8 knots that we can probably talk for another hour, but I think I would say thank you for what you're doing, first of all,
Yeah.
and getting the word out there. And I would, yeah, just encourage people to take this journey for themselves and be critical, question, and look inside and find those answers. Don't rely on somebody to figure it out for you, but
Mhm.
look inside, and that process of self-understanding can really change things, and it did for me. No, again, just thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, this was great. Saying, I know you've shared your book, but for listeners that want to learn more about your work, or even if you're open to sharing, if they wanted to get a
Yeah,
reach of you, what are
absolutely.
some ways they can do that?
Sure, yeah, so the website is yourdefaultmode.com, one word, your default mode. The book is there, you can start reading it for free. I have links to my other 2 books, and the audiobook will be out in a few weeks. So for folks who prefer audiobooks, but yeah, my social media handles are all on the bottom of that website. So you can email me. There's a link there too.
For sure. And we'll put that in the show note captions as well. But yeah, this has been great, Hussein. Thank you so much for your time and your willingness to come on here and share your insight and wisdom with us. And we could probably do a part two to this where we talk about the other 8 knots. So I appreciate that. And yeah, this has been great.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.